Hi everybody, this is Aisling. We're going to delve into Module 5, which is officially Week 6, our, our coverage of the 4 transcultural nursing theory articles that you read for this week. So by the conclusion of this module, you should be able to understand the use and the value of nursing theory and practice. Hopefully you got a little bit of this in your undergraduate degree. I know I didn't get that much, so I really found that in my master's degree in nursing, that's where I really came to understand nursing theory. And coming from a background in English, I was an English major as an undergrad, it made sense to me, but it's also hard to kind of envision how you can apply theory in the practice of nursing, which is so physical and interactive and stuff. So I'm hoping that by going through the lecture today, we can have a better understanding of that. I want to go through each of the articles and distinguish the 4 leading theories of transcultural nursing. I think transcultural nursing is really the area that's seen the greatest amount of dynamic change over the past 30 years, really. That it's the area that's the most relevant, and we'll talk about why that is. But I hope that by the end of the presentation today, you'll have a better understanding, and after reading the articles, of why it's relevant to be talking about transcultural nursing and how to apply some of the key tenets and really make it work for you in your practice as an APRN. And then finally, I hope that we can, through this discussion, help you better envision how you might use your selected theory in your PICO presentation project as a way to organize your presentation and just as an overall organizing framework. So let's get started. In general, nursing theory, I'm going to use these 2 quotations from the book that actually I used as a graduate student, Advanced Community Health Nursing Practice by Naomi Irvin, as just a reminder of nursing theory and the intent of nursing theory. A theory is an internally consistent group of relational statements that presents a systematic view about a phenomenon and that is useful for description, explanation, prediction, and/or control. So a theory is a way to consistently apply a framework or way of thinking to a problem, typically, or an issue or a situation, so that you are approaching it from the same point of view every time you look at it, or every time you look at a related series of situations. Centering your own practice in a theory of nursing or of behavior change can be helpful because then you kind of have a compass from which you practice. That's sort of the theory that you most relate to, or the way that you think about your practice may be most closely aligned with a particular nursing theory or theorist, and that having that as sort of a guideline or as a organizing framework can help you when you don't have an evidence-based article to frame your decision making about a course of treatment or a course of action for a program upon. Nursing theory is particularly useful if you are trying to institute a change in practice across the continuum of care or across a group of providers, so that you can help them all get on the same page and openly discuss, okay, here's why we need to change, here's the evidence, but here's the framework that we're going to use to organize the way that we make that change take place. So that's how nursing theory can really be turned into action, is by looking at it as a mechanism to guide the change of systems. The second quotation, the relational statements in a theory are used by the advanced practice community health nurse to develop a protocol that puts into place the hypothesized relationships and expected outcomes. So this is to say that you use a theory to develop a way of approaching the solving of a problem into a stepwise way of working through that problem. And if you use a theory, then you've got a map that you can go by and you can refer back to, and it's grounded in more than just, it seemed like the best way to do it, or it was what everybody decided to do together, or we found one article that said that was a good idea. If you use a nursing theory to ground the progression through the steps, it's something that you can really grasp a hold of, and there are other articles written about that theory and the implementation of projects based in that theory that you can refer to, and you can say, okay, based on how this group of researchers implemented their project using this theory, we will also do the same, or we will do it differently because they used this theory and they had XYZ outcomes. So we're going to test this hypothesis in a different way, still following that same theory, but with a different intervention that we're choosing. So having a theory is especially useful when you don't have a model that you can replicate kind of verbatim, word for word, because in many cases you may be trying to blend several different articles that you're using as your evidence base, but you need something to kind of help you work through how to actually implement them. And having a nursing theory is really a good way to ground that process, especially because it gets a lot of team members who are also participating in the implementation all on the same page, because you've all read the same article and you've discussed, the articles before you get started and decided upon the implementation pattern. So here are the steps in using a theory to develop an intervention. You identify the theory. It's helpful to then diagram or outline relationships among the concepts that are in the theory. If you have multiple theories, then and you want to, like, for example, you have a nursing theory, but then you also have a theory of behavior change, and you want to include those, drawing it out and figuring out how you're going to do that can be very helpful, especially as a group. You also, this is also where it may be helpful to really look at the way that you're prioritizing the theory that you're going with and how the group has come to that decision, because it's not always necessarily, a way, an automatic kind of way of doing things. You would want to look at alternatives to that intervention so that you can show that you've considered other alternatives. You want to read as many applications of that theory to similar contexts, to the either patient population or the setting or the clinical question that you're dealing with, so that you have some points of reference. You decide upon the preferred intervention among all the interventions, and you sort of, discuss or state aloud why you decided to go with that intervention. And then you develop a practice protocol, which is like developing a protocol for your research intervention. But this says how you're going to consistently include patients and communicate the intent of the intervention to the patients that will be involved, how you will carry out the intervention, how you will collect data about the intervention, how you will evaluate the process and the outcome variables of interest. And all of that is determined before you actually start. And then you actually do the intervention and perform the implementation of that selected intervention, collecting during the process, collecting the data, and then using that data to go back and refine the practice protocol. This is where this arrow goes back into practice protocol, or looking at an intervention alternatives. So you decided, after you looked at all of the different interventions to choose from, to go with one. It didn't work, so you try out another. So this is sort of an iterative, circular pattern until you like the nursing process, determine that the intervention has been successful. So having a theory grounding that is a really critical part of planning an intervention. So then that may beg the question, why didn't we talk about nursing theories at the beginning of this course rather than kind of at this point when we're in the middle of already talking about how to assess needs and what are sources of data and how do you plan an intervention and looking at logic models and stuff. I think really it's because number one, until you have some of that groundwork laid, it's very difficult to think in very practical terms about how you would actually integrate one of these articles into your practice. I think getting to this point where you've already chosen a PICO question, you've kind of worked through the beginnings of envisioning what resources would be involved, who the population is, having gotten some feedback about that. Now you can kind of step back and think about, okay, what's the best way to ground the PICO question that I've selected? So that's really the intent of introducing the transcultural nursing theories at this point. So what are the four theories? These are in order, and I should have included the dates next to them, but I have the dates on the next few slides. The Madeline Leininger was a researcher that since the 1950s, I think as she states several times in that article, I just find her writing very entertaining. I'll say, I'll put it that way. I want to be flattering, but also just kind of recognize the self-aggrandizing kind of language that's used both in her article and also in the Purnell article. There's just this kind of undercurrent that I can't help but name of them sort of identifying themselves as the first person to ever think of the needs of people who are not like them, which kind of is oblivious to the fact that people who are not like them in, as nurses in positions of power and white people at that, live with the position that they are in, and particularly if they're the recipient of care, not just nurses, in living the life, the consequences of incompetent cultural care. So I find those articles a little much, but by the same token, I think that they were these theorists, particularly Leininger. I'm sorry, I think it's Leininger. She was like kind of a lone wolf. Even when I was in nursing school in 2003, 2004, I remember, our professors, and this is before some of her, more recent articles, kind of like writing her off as kind of a kooky lady, because at that time most of the work that she was doing was about systems theory, which is part of transcultural nursing, but there are other nursing systems theorists, who are also kind of they're 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 thinking in sort of larger terms than direct patient care, and I think that there was this perception that they were thinking so far, up in the ether, like just kind of really far away from direct patient care, that they were losing sight of what real life is like. I think she was probably less so than some others, but there's also this sense that she feels that she was the only one recognizing the need for culturally responsive or culturally what she calls culturally competent care, but which is based in anthropology. And I think if you guys are familiar with anthropology and how it originated, I think while its intentions were noble and positive in trying to better understand and better feature non-dominant cultures. So a lot of anthropology, a lot of early anthropology was focused on better understanding the cultures of the world. The tragedy in that was that it was always from a perspective of the mainstream and the other, the dominant and the subservient, and that a lot of anthropology turned to biometrics or assessments of people's intelligence according to Western standards. So I'm always a little bit suspect of the melding of nursing and anthropology, as a practicing nurse, because I think that there's always the danger of continuing or perpetuating that perspective of dominant and other in the comparative in the comparison of cultures, and identifying those who have cultures that are not white European as other makes it seem, number one, as though those cultures are exotic and therefore less valid, but number two, also doesn't center those cultures. It always is centered in the dominant culture, which is, not really a postmodern kind of approach to, nursing theory, which I think that we're past that point now in 2022. Okay, so let me stop picking on Madeline Leininger, but let's go through each of these theories one by one. So this is called her what's it called? It's called the sunshine model or something. I'm sorry. Sunrise model. I'm sorry. So the sunrise model to depict dimensions of the theory of culture, care, diversity, and universality. The purpose of culture care theory is to discover and explain diverse and universally culturally based care factors influencing health. So at the center of you can start with her model, you can start either at the top, or you can start in the middle, or you can start at the bottom in reading it. Some nursing models, like, they're very prescriptive about how you're supposed to interpret them, but hers, specifically says that you can start anywhere on the model, really, that a person's worldview is shaped by their cultural and social structure dimensions. I'm just reading down the model that's here, and then that those components of a person's experience, which she calls factors, I believe, are the factors that influence health. So there are technological factors, religious and philosophical factors, kinship and social factors, cultural values, beliefs, and life ways, political, legal factors, economic factors, and educational factors. So each of those different I guess what we call factors, but really are kind of domains of life, impact a person's worldview ultimately, but then they're influenced by how they experience care. So care expressions, patterns, and practices, and they influence care expressions, patterns, and practices. So that's to say, they someone's, for example, political and legal factors are influenced by the way that they are cared for and their access to care because of what they can politically or legally access. Does that make sense? So for example, someone's personal politics about their beliefs about reproductive health, for example, influences how they access reproductive services. Likewise, the prevailing laws of a country or a state influence how a person is able to access their reproductive health, the facets of their reproductive health, and exert control over them. In addition to care expressions, patterns, and practices, which is more kind of formal healthcare, they also have these expressions of holistic health, illness, and death. So they have a life, they have a perspective of what health means that's outside of whether they visit the doctor or not, or how often they visit the doctor. It's a holistic idea of what health is for them. For some people, health means being able to get fresh air every day. For some people, illness means not being in balance, or for other people, illness only means when you're in the hospital, hospitalized. For other people, death is less of a end of the road kind of a thing, and it's more of a transition to another life. So all of that is likewise impacted by these different factors, educational, economic, political, etc., and influences how those factors play out in people's lives. So it's this dynamic interplay with these very heavy influences. The care expressions, that's more formal healthcare, and then holistic health, illness, and death, which is informal healthcare, health life, health balance, I guess. Underpinning the sunrise is focus, the level of focus. So that can be either at the individual level, the level of the family, the level of group, which may be, a group of breast cancer survivors, for example. Communities, which may be like a mosque community, or a synagogue community, or a church community, or institutions, which may be a group of people who work at the same place, or a people who live in the same state under the institution of that state. In diverse life contexts. These contexts are the context of the nursing care practices, professional care practices, and generic care. So the access to services, like how close are you to a farmer's market, or is there specialized pediatric mental health care in your community that you can access. These influence transcultural care decisions and actions. So all of these things make a difference as to how well you can preserve or maintain the quality of care that you receive, how well you can accommodate and negotiate, and I think you could say navigate the care that you receive, and then how well you repattern or restructure. And this is more about taking what's there and making it yours, or relearning. I think one of the examples that I could think of would be you have a life, you have your way of seeking healthcare in your own culture, in the culture of the country that you come from, and then you're displaced, either due to war or, fleeing hardship or famine or whatever it is, you're displaced to live in another country. You have to either reconstitute the way that you sought care in that other country or culture, or reconstruct and rebuild the way that you sought care. This interplay between what the individual or community, whatever level you're operating or considering this at, and the healthcare structures that are in place is what can lead to or lead you astray from culturally congruent care. And culturally congruent care is not just for seeking healthcare, it's how well are you living and how well are you dying. Central to Leininger's theory is the need for centering care. I think when she first started talking about care as the essential component of nursing, people kind of were like, if you start saying that nursing is all about caring or is all about love, which is there's another theorist that kind of focuses on the role of love and compassion, people are going to think that you're silly. You can't, if you're trying to combat assumptions about the validity of nursing as its own profession, as opposed to nursing as a science allied with medicine, that it should be its own kind of discipline with its own valid practice model. You can't use soft terms like love or like care. You need to be talking about quantitative sciences and quantifiable outcomes, and you need to be just as what they would consider serious. But I think what Leininger has done is really said care is really serious. Providing care that's responsive and that takes into consideration where people are coming from is serious, and it's scientific, and you can quantify it, and you can improve it by giving it the attention that it deserves. And if you center nursing in care, it does distinguish it from the provision of medical care, which medical care is not necessarily focused on wellness at its center or care at its center. It's focused on disease. It's focused on disease, and it's focused on preventing and combating disease. So Leininger's four theory tenets are that culturally based care has differences and some common features, that there's things that are cross-cultural and that are culture specific, and that delivering care that's responsive to those differences and commonalities is culturally based care. That there's so many factors that influence care outcomes, those factors that are around the rays of the sunrise. So technological, philosophical, social factors, etc. That there are emic and etic practices that influence outcomes. And emic are those that are internal to a person or internal to their understanding of the world. And I want to make sure that I'm going to quote this because I want to make sure that I'm being clear, because I tend to conflate these. I want to make sure I'm not being. So emic means lay, folk, or indigenous practices and profession, and lay, folk, or indigenous practices. And then etic influences are professional nursing practices. So those practices that are a part of delivering medical care or nursing care that are not culturally derived or sensitive. How do I say it? Not sensitive, because they should both be sensitive, but not derived from a cultural tradition. So emic and etic practices influence outcomes, because if you neglect one or the other, you're going to get an imbalance of care. And then that there are 3 modes for actions and decisions to achieve culturally congruent and beneficial care. And this is what we just talked about: the preservation or maintenance, accommodation or negotiating, and repatterning or restructuring. And then she suggests the application of an enabler tool to structure the actual intervention, because it can help you stay kind of on task with the nursing theory. So if you chose Leininger's model, you could take a clinical question. Should have thought of an example before we started, but you could take a clinical question like, does teaching in the inpatient setting how to use a diabetes self-monitor on a pediatric floor, is the intervention more successful if it takes place, at the bedside or at a follow-up visit? Doing those comparisons, like, let's just say that's your PICO question. So working through that, you would think about the technological factors. So introduction of a new technology. They've been using finger sticks. Now you want to do a continuous glucose monitor. How ready is this 8-year-old to take that on as a type 1 diabetic? How ready is the family? Religious and philosophical factors. Are there any religious or philosophical differences with the way that the family might consider this new technology, or having the child take responsibility for it? Is that going to impact the way that you teach about it? Kinship and social factors. What kind of relationship does the child have with family who could be supportive of them learning this new skill and be reinforcing the progress that they're making? Cultural values, beliefs, and life ways. Are there other cultural factors that may be impacting their readiness to take on this new kind of technology? Are there political and legal factors to consider, economic factors to consider, and educational factors to consider? So what she suggests is literally drawing out this tool and writing in those different components. And then what are the influences, care expressions, patterns, practices, and then holistic health. Like, what is the child's understanding of health, illness, and death, and does that play a bigger part? And in this way, if you kind of work through the enabler tool, which is what the model, or the visual of the model, so that the diagram that goes with the model is, you can kind of start to perceive where are the parts that have more text on them, because you have more things to say about that. And is there an imbalance? Is there a factor that's going to be something that you really need to think about more seriously as you work through your PICO, for example? Or as you work through a evaluation plan, like, how easy is it going to be to collect data if the people that you are planning to implement this project with don't have a mechanism to collect the data that you want to collect? Those kinds of things are the way to think this through. So the Leininger, she kind of started the conversation on culture care, on culturally sensitive or culturally competent care, and kind of set the stage for the next of these models. The Geiger and Davidizar transcultural assessment model proposes that each individual is culturally unique, that they may be a member of a culture, but that their interpretation of that culture and their practice of that culture is unique to their interpretation of the culture, but also like their life circumstances and the experiences that they've had. Individuals should be assessed according to 6 cultural phenomena. These are the cultural phenomena they've determined are most influential on health. So their way of communicating, their understanding of personal space, how far people should stand. And each of these, it's like all of the aspects of it. So for communication, you know, whether someone is interprets information that's communicated to them best through written words, if they take written words more seriously than they take verbal instructions, if what's their literacy level, what's their language, you know, what's their preferred language, what's their primary language, all of those factors. Do they communicate readily, or they communicate only what's needed? What's culturally, where are they coming from in that respect? And then for space, how close do they like to be to other people? How do they like to be touched? Do they not like to be touched? How comfortable are they with physical interaction? Those kinds of things. Social organization indicates how the family functions, or how that person sees himself in relation to others. Many people don't have families. Many people exist in a family of friends or of acquaintances, or don't interact with family because their families are not positive and supportive in their lives. So this may also refer to how they exist in the social circles that they participate in, their social interests, their work life, their religious life, etc. How do people relate to time, whether they're past, present, or future oriented, and how they can understand their better understanding and recognition of their own time orientation can make a difference on how well they will respond to interventions and participate in interventions, and how successful those interventions will be. Environmental control is the ability of the person to control nature and to direct factors in the environment that affect them. So this one is always tricky a little bit for me to understand. It's the example that's in the article, I think, is pretty brief, but the idea that you have you can exert control over your environment is very culturally specific, but it's also specific to how well you're able to control your locus, how much your locus of control is within your power. So, for example, a person who's in a situation with intimate partner violence and being controlled by another person or coerced by another person may not have environmental control, even though they are, an individual who can get up and leave, supposedly whenever they want to. So that's a situation, for example. Other examples, I think the example that they use in the article is sort of if a person comes from a cultural belief in which there's less belief in internal control and more in external control, there may be a fatalistic view in which seeking healthcare is viewed as useless. So if someone has been told that they are fated to do X, Y, Z, or that the the ability to exert control is determined by powers beyond their control, like physical phenomena, or the weather, or something of that nature, that they may feel that no matter what they do, they don't actually exert any control. And then biological variations, they go into a lot in this, kind of picking out biological vulnerabilities that specific groups have. I think another component that it's important to recognize is that all of these biological variations are also influenced by culture and by societal bias and racism. So I think it's very difficult to tease out, like, the rate for diabetes appears to be 2.6 higher for Native Americans between 25 and 54 compared to the rest of the general population. But there's so many other concomitant factors that influence the quality of healthcare available to and trust in healthcare systems, that it's very difficult to tease out that as a singular biological factor that operates independent of any other factors. I'm not going to say that there isn't a biological component to it, but I don't think these biological variations exist in isolation. And I don't think that the authors are trying to imply that either. I think what they've pointed to in some of the ways that the theory has been tested or utilized is to take all of these factors into consideration. So that, oops, sorry, I think I went forward without meaning to. But anyway, the point being that the Geiger and David's cultural transcultural assessment model is really a way to assess specific domains that are so heavily influenced by culture, and understanding those is a good way to initiate kind of an assessment of a person. That said, I think the first assessment, and I think this is kind of borne out in a lot of the other articles and things that we've been reading, the first assessment should always be of the provider's own biases and recognition of any potential for bias that may be generated internally. So you can't say that you're just assessing a patient on these 6 domains, that you actually are assessing yourself at the same time to be cognizant of any biases as you encounter them. The Purnell model for cultural competence. This is the funny guy. This is a professor who worked with nursing students, undergrad nursing students, and determined that they were being culturally insensitive often when they were doing their clinicals, it sounds like, which I can say, having also been a clinical instructor for undergrad nurses, it's not surprising. And he proposed this model that kind of, again, does an assessment and a heightened awareness inventory of where community members who are seeking care may be coming from, so that we can be aware of our own biases, as well as be responsive and respectful of clients' cultural beliefs and practices. So he outlines, he differentiates between cultural awareness, which is a very passive kind of appreciation of external signs of diversity, cultural sensitivity, which is being our way of being with other people so as not to offend. So our sensitivity to other people's cultures and the value they place in those practices. And then cultural competence is building ongoing knowledge and skills to interact with people in a way that does not offend them, but also to accumulate knowledge about their culture. And that organizational cultural competence is sort of at the meta level of an organization, putting in place structures and policies and procedures so that the organization can move towards more responsive kind of practice, that the mission and philosophy address, serving a diverse population, that the class standards, the culturally linguistic and appropriate services standards that are, set by the CDC are put into play, that the setting of the care environment is responsive or reflective of the people that are served there. Those kinds of things are some of the improvements that they suggest would be part of organizational cultural competence. So his model for cultural competence is depicted in the graphic, the diagram to the right, that it's important that you not stereotype, and that you move towards understanding people as individuals, but that in order to do that, you need to become familiar with different cultures, different ways of being, different practices, and that that there is an acknowledgement of the bidirectionality of these understandings, that as you assess someone's cultural relation to the unknown, which is represented by the dark circle in the middle, so their understanding of either what they consider God or how they consider chance, or how they may consider, if you're talking about pregnancy, like why you get pregnant or why you don't get pregnant. Things that are unknown are represented at the center of the circle. So that can be related to any of these spokes, any of these pie pieces on the chart. So family roles in organization, communication, heritage, healthcare practitioners, workforce issues. At the center is this kind of acknowledgement that there's things that can't be understood, but that varies from person to person. The bidirectional nature of things, what I was saying before, is that you can use this tool to assess your patient, but you can also use it reflectively to assess your own, where you stand on those things. So you may assess a patient and realize their understanding of high-risk behaviors is very different from your own understanding of high-risk behaviors, and so that may influence how you approach them about it, for example. It provides a framework for provider learning, because it is so specific, like in terms of nutrition. It's not just like, what kind of foods do you eat, or, how often do you eat in a day, but what is the meaning of foods? What are some of the common foods that you eat? What are some of the rituals around food? What are some, common deficiencies? What are some limitations to accessing food? And how would the best way to promote nutrition be with you in the context of you as an individual, you as part of a family? These are the rings that going outwards, and you as part of a community. So these are sort of the layers that they built this out at. The meta paradigm is, so there's some controversy that he points to in the article about some Leininger, for example, doesn't support the nursing meta paradigm concept. I think that really means that she feels that this is not something that's universally applicable across multiple domains. So he says that his theory should be able to be applied not only to clinical care and the care of an individual or care populations as a nurse, but also to educational settings, research settings, administration, and management of healthcare services. So he thinks that it should be applicable, across the board, and that there are primary and secondary characteristics of culture. So primary being those that can't be changed, those that are, inherent, and then those that are secondary are those that are adopted or adapted. He gives the example of somebody who's been displaced, and let's see. A person may acculturate in the workforce in terms of language and practices, but speak their native language and adhere to traditional practices when they're at home. So secondary characteristics include educational status, economics, socioeconomic status, occupation and military experience, etc., as compared to primary characteristics, which are nationality, race, color, gender, age, religious affiliation. And I think you could probably argue that religious affiliation is potentially also a secondary characteristic. So that's sort of the Purnell model. If you were going to take this and apply it to your PICO question, I think you would take each of those 12 domains, and like with the Leininger model, you could even use this the diagram here as a way to sort of like think through each of those domains, and then how your intervention would impact the person, the family, the community, and then potentially like be impacted by the global society as a practice change. And then you probably want to discuss, some of I think the piece of how they have these bidirectional arrows around the center that kind of encircle the center, meaning that there's interrelationship, and you probably want to discuss that and which factors may be more or less relevant with your PICO question. So the Kapina-Bakod process of cultural competence in the delivery of healthcare services. This is a really PCCDHS, long, long title, purports that cultural competence is an ongoing process. So this is the first one that sort of acknowledged an evolutionary kind of transcendent or transitional nature to that you don't just become culturally competent and you're done, that it's an ongoing growth process and evolutionary process. The healthcare professional strives to work effectively within the cultural context of the patient, and that the best way of learning about a patient is to continue to seek out opportunities to speak to or work with patients who are from the same culture as that patient, or maybe affiliated with a variation of that patient's culture. So you are becoming rather than being competent, and it's the central focus of the discipline of nursing is a caring presence that's found within the nurse-patient relationship that reveals new vision and understanding of human health experience. So it's ongoing and it's evolutionary, and it's focused on that connection that occurs between a patient and a practitioner, and the care that's exerted, the care that is delivered or shared with that person through the interpersonal communication and connection. It requires compassion to remain curious and solicitous and grow in your awareness and development of relationship to that culture, and that you can't take, an experience or 7 experiences with people of one culture and say that you understand that culture, that there's always going to be new iterations and new experiences because everybody's cultures are also continually changing. And that every patient needs a cultural assessment, not just those who don't look like the dominant culture or don't act like the dominant culture or speak the dominant culture's language, not just those who look like they do, that every patient needs a cultural assessment because you never know where people are coming from. So this model is an ongoing journey of unremitting cultural encounters that, while it's a pursuit of cultural competence, it's based on individual encounters. So it's not necessarily utilizing those encounters to generalize, but to build a base of knowledge about a culture. So it proposes that you have you asked yourself the question that needs to be answered, or have I asked myself the right questions? ASK being the acronym that stands for awareness, skills, knowledge, encounters, and desire. Awareness: am I aware of my biases and prejudices towards other cultural groups, as well as the existence of racism and other isms in healthcare? And I think this is, you could take this, if you were doing your PICO question, for example, and break this down and say, am I aware of my biases towards the population that I'm working with? Am I aware of racisms or other isms that may be relevant to my clinical situation? Skill: do I have the skill of conducting a cultural assessment in a culturally sensitive manner? So am I asking questions with humility? Am I conducting a cultural assessment and looking at people's needs by asking these questions? And am I doing it in a way that is responsive and sensitive? Knowledge: am I knowledgeable about the worldviews of different cultural and ethnic groups? That should say different instead of difference, sorry. As well as knowledge in the field of biocultural ecology. And, you know, we're going to get to this on the next slide, but there are terms in these articles that you may not be familiar with, so I would really encourage you to look them up, and if they're relevant, to make sure that you integrate those into your final presentation so that so it's clear that you have a thorough understanding of the theory that you've chosen. So what is biocultural ecology? And encounters: do I seek out face-to-face or other types of sacred encounters with individuals who are different from myself? And in terms of sacred encounters, you know, my interpretation, and this may be different, is that moment when you are talking to someone or working with someone and you find a spark, you find that communication kind of breakthrough, that makes that a real, authentic encounter that is precious. And they use the word sacred here. And then finally, desire: do I really want to become culturally competent? Am I willing to put in the work? Do I have the cultural curiosity? Do I have the commitment to social justice? Like, am I working towards accumulating an increasing level of cultural competence as I progress through my professional career? I think that's really where they're going with that. I like this one. I think this is a really compelling model, but I think a lot of them are applicable to the PICO questions that you guys have chosen. So why are we talking about transcultural nursing theories? There's so many other theories out there for nursing. I'll say that nursing theory development really started in the second half of the 20th century, and that it's, I would say, took off in the 90s and 2000s, because things have changed a lot. I think there's been a greater focus as we've kind of move towards the doctoral degree as the kind of entry level for practice for some levels of nursing, that there's been more of a focus on what are we doing and how is it different from medicine. Why are we talking about transcultural nursing? Well, because it's the most relevant right now. That if you're talking about population-based nursing as an APRN, that doesn't happen, in isolation. And having a model to ground it that acknowledges the multiplicity of influences that may impact the success of your intervention is really critical. You have to be transparent and acknowledge that our culture and our country and even internationally, we are becoming more cognizant of each other's cultures, and those are assets. Those are things to build on and to value. To value them, we really need to be steeped in a cultural humility and a place of willingness to learn. And that's how we deliver the best care. So that's why we're talking about transcultural nursing theories. Another thing to keep in mind is that most research and nursing research in particular, but social research and most interventions are now integrating the voice of the participants more. So, these articles, there was a couple of articles that were like, it's so important to make sure that participants or recipients of care have a voice in, or are shared, that you share the results of your research with them, or that you give them an opportunity to give feedback on your model. Now, which most of these articles, I think 2011 was the most recent article. 10 years since then, it's pretty standard to make sure that you have a participant or an end user on every element, from developing an evaluation plan to an implementation of the actual intervention, making sure that there's participants that are also guiding the implementation, that you can't have projects that don't have some sort of advisory committee from the community. And that is only enhancing the success of these interventions, because you're learning about issues before they become issues, because you're not designing projects in a vacuum. Participant engagement hinges upon a thorough understanding of the population's needs, assets, readinesses, and challenges. A really critical component now, which I didn't learn about when I was in nursing school. Nursing school, we learn about doing a needs assessment. Now we teach about performing readiness assessments. So can't plan an entire intervention and spend all the money and time to develop evaluation for it until you acknowledge that the community you're proposing to implement the change in isn't ready for the change, or is ready for the change. And that saves you so much time and effort and money if you realize that up front by doing a readiness assessment. Like, is the community that I'm proposing to do this intervention with ready for the change that I'm proposing to implement? So, we have all these behavior change theories, trans-theoretical model of change, and so forth, like precede, proceed, all of those that we've been talking about. You really doing a readiness assessment is part of that sensitivity and humility, to say that maybe I don't know what people need. Maybe the people know what they need, and they can tell me when they will be ready and what needs to be in place before they will be ready for the change that I'm proposing to make. So how do I use all of this in my PICO presentation? My suggestion is to choose one of the theories, dig deeper, read a few additional articles that further elucidate the theory, or apply it to a similar context as your PICO setting or problem. Look at how placing the PICO issue in the context of one of these theories can help you think through the validity of your question, issues with implementation or evaluation you may have not considered, or the need to further refine your population of interest. In your presentation, include an introductory section on your selected theory, where you provide an overview of the theory, why you chose it, and its relevance to your issue. So this should be part of your presentation. Like my PICO question was XYZ. The reason that I'm interested in it is because of this. I chose the HCSS, whatever this one is called, PCCDHS model, because I think that it captures such and such about the question that I'm asking. I also considered this model or this model, but this one was chosen because of this, because of its relevance in specific aspects. If one of the theories that's included for today, one of these 4 theories, is not suitable, you've decided, like, you've read through all of them and you're like, I don't feel like this is, like, makes sense for my project. And if you have another nursing theory that you've identified that would be more, if you don't think it fits with any of these, but you don't have another nursing theory, you can reach out and I can help to guide you. But really, I want you guys to be looking through other nursing theories if these 4 don't work. But you should be able to use one of these 4 for your presentation. If you decide to go with another model, be prepared to make this section of your presentation a little bit longer and more comprehensive, because keep in mind that you're not just presenting to me, you're presenting to your colleagues. And so your colleagues are going to have a discussion response based on your presentation that's graded. So you want to make sure that you're not shortchanging them and that they understand what you're trying to say, because if you're using one of the theories that's one of the assigned articles, they've already got that prior knowledge of what that theory is about. So if you don't, if you miss some aspect of it as you're describing the central tenets of the theory, they can sort of fall back on their prior knowledge because they read an article about it. But if you're introducing a theory, you're not going to expect them to read an article about a theory that wasn't one of our assigned articles. So I just want you to keep in mind, if you choose another theory that's beyond one of these 4 theories that we've talked about and everybody has read, be sure to use part of your presentation to kind of really describe it and describe why you chose it and why you felt that the others didn't work and why this one did work, so that your colleagues can respond in their discussion post, not feeling like they're lost. Okay, so I think that is the end. That's the last slide. I'm gonna be posting another lecture on chapter 7, I think. So on the second half of chapter 7, because we started chapter 7 last week, but I wanted to, we only kind of touched on the beginning of it, so I'm going to include another part of that, and then chapter 8. So okay, thank you.